The hearing will come to order, and good morning to all of you. We open today's hearing knowing that Pastor David Lin is back in the United States after nearly 2 decades unjustly detained. Pastor Lin's crime was that he worked to strengthen the Protestant Chinese house church movement. For this, he received a life sentence. We are overjoyed for the Lin family. This commission has pressured both the previous administration as well as this one, and we are happy that the Biden administration did help facilitate his return. So much, the agony that all of you here are experiencing, not just today, but every single day and night. I don't know how you do it. It's got to be beyond words cruel what the Chinese Communist Party has put you through and your loved ones. Despite the release of David Lin, we now know, and we know beyond more than anywhere else in the world, wrongfully detained U.S. nationals are serving Sudan, Kai Lee, Nelson Wells, and Dawn Michelle Hunt know these hard facts. You know these hard facts all too well. They have all languished far too long in Chinese prisons. The Foley Foundation identifies 11 wrongfully detained Americans in China, including those subject to exit bans. John Kam, however, the preeminent expert on political prisoners in China, estimates that there are 200 or more Americans, citizens, coercively detained, with 30 Americans being held under exit bans where U.S. citizens are stopped from leaving China to settle economic disputes or to coerce their relatives to return to China to face alleged crimes. This is absolutely unacceptable. If the Chinese government wants to improve relations with the United States, they should release Americans who are wrongfully imprisoned without condition and unilaterally end the use of exit bans, a form of de facto hostage-taking that violates Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a treaty that the PRC has signed, though it is not yet ratified. And I would note parenthetically, they went for years getting all kinds of accolades here in Washington that they had signed that covenant. And that covenant and didn't ratify it. And it's not enforceable anyway, but it is a good statement of principles, and we wish that they would at least ratify it. The release of American citizens should be the first thing President Biden says to Communist Party Xi Jinping whenever they talk. Their names should be said so often that Xi Jinping memorizes them. Their cases should be agenda item number 1 at every meeting the Secretary of State has with Chinese officials. And every U.S. official traveling to China, and that includes members of Congress, Senate, and House, and of course, members of the administration at every level, they should be constantly raising the names of those who have been held, Americans being held in captivity. Every channel of the U.S. government must be focused on the release of wrongfully detained Americans. It's that simple. All Americans detained in China deserve robust diplomatic assistance to gain their transfer out of prison, or at least, at the very least, to have more frequent U.S. consular officials visit, more frequent and longer visits with their families, and better access to legal representation and health care, which is almost non-existent. Given the legal system in China and the poor prison conditions, more Americans should be considered to be unjustly detained by the State Department. That list needs to grow based on the facts. How many Americans currently in Chinese prisons received a transparent trial with a genuine legal defense in an impartial Chinese court? In China's rule of bylaw system, where the party can dictate guilt or innocence, and it's so often guilt, there is none of that. It doesn't exist. Of the poor conditions in PRC prisons, where Chinese and foreigners alike are forced to work long hours, where they are often tortured or mistreated by guards and other prisoners, where they suffer from insufficient medical care and nutrition. Your testimonies today about what you and your families have endured while jailed should be, and we will submit it as evidence of torture to the UN Committee Against Torture for its coming review of China. We need more people speaking out. There's been far too few voices. And of course, the UN has a golden opportunity, particularly UN Committee on Torture, to speak out and to do so robustly. I will ask our staff to work with you to submit your testimonies to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the U.S. mission in Geneva. But that's just a start. Given the number of Americans detained and the Chinese Communist Party's willingness to engage in this ongoing atrocity. To that end, I will introduce, along with Tom Suozzi, a bill that will, among other things, direct the U.S. Department of State to create a strategy for gaining the release of your family members. Gain insight into the diplomatic tools the State Department is using for your family members. #078, bolstering efforts to bring hostages and wrongfully detained U.S. citizens home. Seek more transparent information from the State Department about cases of your loved ones, including gaining access to the resources in Congress allocated to assist families with the financial burdens of advocacy. I know this is a very tough and emotional day for our witnesses, but every day and every night is tough and emotional. Again, I don't know how you endure it. No amount of words or empathy from us can replace your missing loved ones. I hope that you know that our purpose here today in an absolute bipartisan way, and Senator Merkley and I work like brothers on these issues, and we will work very hard. And I know, here in the Senate, of course, over in the House, it'll not personally done enough either. And so it's time we did more as well. Thank you so much for being here. Your loved ones are in our prayers. I yield to my good friend and colleague, co-chair, Senator Merkley.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, for convening this hearing, and much appreciation to each of you for coming. For more than 2 decades, the members of Congress and executive who have been unjustly jailed by Chinese authorities for seeking to exercise basic human rights. Our commission maintains a political prisoner database that currently has 2,764 nationals of the People's Republic of China known or believed to be detained. And as the chairman pointed out, the Foley Foundation has a list of about a dozen individuals, American individuals, wrongfully detained in China, but estimates by human rights organizations go up to about 200 Americans detained. We don't know the exact number, but we know this: even one American detained as a political prisoner in China is one too many. If an American breaks the law in China, that individual can be prosecuted just as a Chinese national would be here in the United States. But here's the problem. Many laws of the PRC are not consistent with and the rule of law is undermined by political considerations. Now, our United States government has been developing some tools to try to counter this. The executive branch issued directives, President Obama in 2015, to implement an interagency response to overseas hostage-taking, including creation of a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs at the State Department. In 2020, President Trump signed into law the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act. In 2022, President Biden issued an executive order to authorize sanctions against foreign government officials and others who are complicit in hostage-taking. With these tools and under President Biden's leadership, we have seen a 42% decrease in the number of detained Americans overseas since the peak of 2002, according to the Foley Foundation. And there have been some high-profile returns, including some from Russia, including Paul Whelan, and even Gerskovich, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, and others. But not every American overseas detained gets a spotlight. Today, we are putting a spotlight on 3 individuals, Kai Lee and Nelson Wells Jr. and Don Hunt. who have been unjustly detained in China for 8 or more years. We want to hear their story from their family members today, because in hearing your story, we're then able to tell the story. We can tell the story to the administration, to the media. Most importantly, we can carry that message and work towards a release with the People's Republic of China. Our Americans in detention suffer from illness, mental anguish. We want to make sure they get proper care and counsel. But most of all, we want them united with their families. And we're joyful that David Lin has been released, that he's now reunited. Unsure what a celebration that is, but we want a celebration for each of your families. Reportedly, China wrongly holds more Americans than any other country. We don't know why the Chinese government refuses to allow them to come home. Our U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, has met with the 3 Americans that we're focused on today. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has raised their cases directly with President Xi. But despite these efforts, despite the tools we have, representations made, the Chinese government continues to turn a blind eye to the suffering and the heartbreak. So here today, we not only hear your stories, but your stories represent the stories of so many American families who have those detained. And they help inform both the details of the circumstances, but also help us ponder what more we can do, as Chairman Smith has suggested. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Chairman Merkley. I'd like to introduce our distinguished witnesses. Oh, Michelle Steele, one of our commissioners, I understand, has just come online, so she's going to have a few opening comments. Michelle? Michelle, are you there? Oh, there she is. Good.
Yes, Americans detained in China. As already mentioned, there are more Americans detained by the CCP than anywhere else in the world. But this doesn't stop at Americans. The CCP and other communist governments, such as North Korea and Vietnam, are imprisoning journalists, human rights defenders, religious figures, and dissidents. One of my constituents had been wrongfully detained in China prison for nearly 2 decades and just returned home this week. And David Lin is a pastor from Garden Grove who was in China helping building a church. He can finally see his family and meet his grandchildren he never met before for the first time in 20 years. Mr. Lin isn't the first person to be jailed for life for committing contract fraud. It is appalling that the CCP requires Christian churches to pledge loyalty to the Communist Party. I'm grateful that he's back in the United States. I have other constituents who live in fear of their loved ones being apprehended by the CCP. One of my constituents has had a loved one tracked by text messages and arrested by CCP authorities while we were in process of helping them flee the country. According to Human Rights Watch, Vietnamese authorities have convicted at least 163 people since 2018 for exercising their rights to freedom of association or freedom of expression against the Vietnam Communist government. I have led many letters to President Biden with the names and sentences of journalists and other prisoners of conscience and urge him to take action to secure their release. As we speak, I'm advocating for the release and protection of Y. Quen Budap and urging his resettlement in the US or Canada. He's a Vietnamese citizen and UN-recognized refugee being held in Thailand on false charges by the Vietnamese communist government. I have urged the State Department to designate Vietnam as a country of particular concern due to their human rights abuses. I especially requested Secretary Blinken prioritize addressing Thich Minh Chu, who has faced continued religious persecution by his government. And I'm hopeful that shining more light on communist authorities falsely detaining innocent people will help bring justice to those already in prison and prevent future detainments. And I'm so happy that Chairman Smith is having this, meeting today and talking about that detainees that, we really have to bring them bring to the free country. And you know what, our job done is not done yet, and we are still working. Thank you for having this meeting today.
Thank you so very much, Commissioner Steele, and thank you for joining us and for your leadership, which has been ongoing and very, very effective. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished panel of people who are fighting so hard for their loved ones, beginning with Nelson Wells Sr. He's the father of Nelson Wells Jr. and a native of New Orleans, Louisiana. He and his wife, Cynthia, who is here with us today as well, now live in Houghton, Louisiana. Mr. Wells is a 20-year U.S. Army veteran stationed all over the country and world, including a stint in the Middle East during the Gulf War. His wife, Cynthia, worked as an Army recruiter for the Department of Defense for 28 years. Both are retired and are now advocating full-time for their son's release. Then we'll hear from Harrison Lee, who is a doctoral student studying statistics, who has begrudgingly had to become a political advocate for his father. Never expected he would have to do this. Kai Lee. He is originally from Long Island, New York, and currently lives in San Francisco Bay Area. He serves on the steering committee of the Bring Our Families Home campaign, an advocacy group of families of Americans wrongfully detained around the world, working together to try to cut through the bureaucratic obstacles to getting assistance and information for their families of wrongfully detained Americans. His greatest wish is for his father to be home and in good health, to see him graduate next spring after missing his college graduation in 2018. We'll then hear from Tim Hunt, who is the brother of Dawn Michelle Hunt and a native of Chicago. He attended Whitney Young Magnet School and DePaul University and served as a Chicago police officer for 28 years. So thank you for that service, as well as to you, Nelson Wells, for your service in the military. But he worked everything: beat car, plainclothes, bicycle, mounted, and forensic unit roles. Serving and protecting the public is a family business, as his mother, father, and 3 uncles were all Chicago police officers as well. Tim retired in 2017 and has been advocating tirelessly for his sister's release from prison. We'll then hear from Peter Humphrey, who is a British sinologist who has spent half a century working and studying China and lived there for 25 years as a student, teacher, journalist, philanthropist, corporate due diligence detective, and then prisoner. In 2013, Peter and his American wife, Yu, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, were wrongfully imprisoned on false charges of illegal information gathering. Their only crime was to have offended someone with connections in the Chinese Communist Party. So it was all about revenge. Since his release in 2015, Peter created a support network, for the families of foreign prisoners to lobby for their welfare and for their release. Through his work, he has become a specialist on justice and imprisonment in China and is undoubtedly the leading authority on foreign prisoners in China. In addition to his work with families and wrongfully detained, he is also an external research affiliate at Harvard University's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, occasional columnist and documentary advisor, and has been a guest speaker at universities and think tanks about China's judicial and penal system. So I would like to thank you for that great work. After suffering so much, you are just giving back so well to try to help all the others who have been left behind. I'd like to now yield to such time as he would like to take to Mr. Wells, Sr.
Good morning, Chair Smith, Co-Chair Merkley, and the esteemed members of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China. Thank you for inviting me and our advisor, Peter Humphrey, to testify at this hearing on Americans detained in China. My name is Nelson Wells Sr. I am a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, and live in Houghton, Louisiana. I am appearing before you on behalf of my wife, Cynthia Wells, our family, and asking for your assistance in bringing home our son, Nelson Wells Jr., who has been unjustly imprisoned in China for 10 years. I served in the United States Army for 20 years, and Cynthia served at the Department of Defense for nearly 28 years. We have been stationed and traveled all over the United States and the world, and most often brought our 2 children with us. In the spring of 2014, we were awakened in the middle of the night by a call that no parent ever wants to receive. Paraphrasing, the mail caller said, "I am a companion of Nelson. He's in trouble. He's been arrested in China. They're going to kill him." Naturally, I thought this was a prank, a scam. We didn't even realize Nelson, then at 40 years old, was in China. When we called his wife in Japan, she learned that he had taken a trip to China, and we knew we had a problem. Over the next weeks and months, we searched out the United States Embassy multiple times to find Nelson or a record of his arrest, but they could not locate him. It was not until we contacted Mr. John Cam at the Daewoo Han Foundation that we were able to confirm that Nelson had indeed been arrested. For Nelson's part, he had been incarcerated all that time in China, a country where he was only visiting, where he did not read or speak the language, and where he did not know if we were looking for him or even had he known it, he was arrested. Frightening and desperate, Nelson was willing to do anything to improve his conditions, even plead partial guilty so that he could enter the prison system to be allowed phone calls home. Ultimately, we learned that Nelson had been arrested on drug charges. As he was leaving the country, he naively agreed to carry a bag of what he thought to be baked goods for a so-called friend through the security at the airport. Those baked goods were allegedly laced with illegal drugs. For that one mistake, that one betrayal, none of our lives will ever be the same. Nelson originally received a life sentence, but that sentence was ultimately reduced in 2019 to 22 years. We are thankful to the Chinese government for that, but his sentence did not include time served. This means that Nelson will not be released until the year 2041. In the years since 2014, my wife and I have become consumed with efforts to secure Nelson's release to ensure his safety and health while in prison. We expended almost all of our savings in those early years via trial and error efforts to help Nelson without meaningful guidance from our own government. For years, we wrote letters to our members of Congress, to the White House, to the State Department officials, to Democrats and Republicans, to anyone who was in position of influence. But our calls for assistance went unanswered until recently. Army citizen service in Beijing was helpful, but some case officers were better than others, and they changed frequently. One of Nelson's former best officers is working with your committee now, and his current case officer is outstanding as well. But no matter how good or how well-meaning, with each swap, it feels like like Nelson, is starting all over. This inconsistency takes a toll on him and has the years of incarceration. Over the years, Nelson has suffered from debilitating chronic pain, seizures, malnutrition, internal issues, dental pain, severe depression, thought of self-harm. We also know that based on family history, Nelson needs regular cancer and heart health screening. He also needs regular contact with a mental health professional, regular calls, ideally, video calls with us, and the ability to speak English with another person on a regular basis. We're thankful to those who have helped us, but we often feel meaningful change is blocked at every turn. For example, Nelson is not considered a political prisoner or held unjust. We've been told that the humanitarian release is not a possibility. And although Nelson has also sought to utilize the 2018 law in China that allows for prisoners transfer to American facility without a bilateral treaty with the home country, the United States still requires a treaty, and so Nelson remains in Chongqing prison. Whatever the path, we are asking, pleading this commission with Congress, with the administration, and with the Chinese government to work together on behalf of our son to create a pathway for outright release or prisoner transfer to a home prison. I hope you will read my longer testimony and attachments so that you understand our full story. I look forward to answering your questions during and after the hearing. Learn more about my Nelson, my son, whom I love, and follow our story at www.nelsonwellsjr.com. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wells. Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Representative Smith and Senator Merkley, for convening this important hearing. It's been a long time coming. All of us here have suffered far too many years, and it is about time, it's past time, for more attention on our loved ones' plight to bring them home. Today marks 2,932 days. That's more than 8 years since my dad, Kai Li, was arrested in Shanghai, China. He spent 2 months under, quote, residential surveillance at a designated location, during which he was held at a secret location, interrogated day and night with no access to legal counsel. Then almost a year passed before he was subject to a closed-door trial, and another year went by before he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for stealing so-called state secrets, even though these alleged secrets can be freely found and searched on the internet, even in China. More than 3 years ago now, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued a landmark decision calling for the release of my dad on the basis that his detention was in fact arbitrary. And yet, despite all this, in more than 8 years, we have seen no visible positive movement on my dad's case. Since 2022, I am fortunate to have gotten to know a really large number of families of American hostages and wrongful detainees around the world through the Bring Our Families Home campaign. In that time, we've seen the campaign shrink dramatically from 18 families now down to just 6, and that's because of Americans who have come home from Afghanistan in September 2022, from Venezuela and Iran in October 2022, Russia in December 2022, Niger and Rwanda in March 2023, then Iran again in September 2023, Venezuela again in December 2023, and of course Russia again last month. And finally, of course, just this past Sunday, we were thrilled to see that David Lin was finally released and reunited with his family after 18 years in China. In fact, I got that news just as I was on the train coming down here to DC. And each time we get this news, it's a really complex mix of emotions because of course, we're just so thrilled for these families. We know, of course, what it's like to have a loved one unjustly missing for so long, and to know that the family is finally being made whole again and that they're on the road to recovery. You just can't help but feel your heart swell with pride and happiness. But at the same time, it begs the question for us, what about my dad? When will it be his turn? One thing that has become clear to us in light of all of these recent developments is that when the various parts of our government, from the State Department to the National Security Council, all the way up to the President himself, when they put their heads together to come up with creative solutions, American hostages and wrongful detainees, in fact, do come home. Frankly, it's incredibly impressive seeing how last month's Russia prisoner swap materialized. Just the sheer level of effort and coordination it took really shows that these cases can be solved. And now, seeing an American finally come home from China last week in a major diplomatic breakthrough, to us, there's really no reason now why my dad, who has now spent more time behind bars than Paul Whelan, Alsu Kermasheva, and Evan Gershkovich combined, cannot come home too. Unfortunately, time is not on our side. No matter who wins November's presidential election, we will have a change of administration. And we know from experience, unfortunately, that means months or even years where absolutely no progress on these cases will be made. And that's because communication channels will need to be reestablished, reworked, and carefully worked out. The goodwill that the Chinese government has built up by releasing Pastor Lin will fade. And so the next few months before President Biden leaves office are a critical window for getting my dad home and getting home all of the Americans wrongfully detained in China. Personally, I've now spent a third of my life missing my dad. Every day I wake up, I shudder at the thought of him crammed in that tiny cell with anywhere from 7 to 11 other people, no climate control, unable to sleep in the summer due to the heat, experiencing the mental and physical anguish that Peter here, unfortunately, can tell you about firsthand, having spent 2 years in the very same prison and the same brigade where my dad is now being held. In his time in captivity, my dad has suffered a stroke. He's lost a tooth. He's endured draconian COVID-19 lockdowns that had him essentially locked in a cell 24/7 for over 3 years. And so I asked President Biden, how much longer does he need to suffer? Thank you.
Mr. Lee, thank you too so very much. and for pointing out that there is a window of opportunity right now. There needs to be a surge. I do hope that whoever wins the presidential will move quickly on this issue as well to bring Americans home. But you're right, the chaos, the beginning of a new administration can frustrate those efforts. So I think the idea that there needs to be a surge right now is so well taken. So thank you for that. Mr. Hunt.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Senator Merkley, and members of the commission, thank you for inviting me today to tell you the story of my sister, Dawn Michelle Hunt. Dawn is incarcerated in Guangdong Women's Prison. She was arrested in 2014 and charged with smuggling, a charge she vehemently denies. Since her incarceration, I've written hundreds of letters to officials, lawyers, and anyone else who would listen. Over the years, things have changed. My sister and my family are getting worn down. Dawn's health is failing, and our father's health is failing as well. It all started when my sister was tricked into believing she won a contest. She received an email stating that she had won an all-expenses-paid trip to Hong Kong. She didn't believe it at first, but she checked on the company and believed they were legitimate. She was in Hong Kong for 9 days and told me that the organizers treated her well. She went sightseeing, shopping, and started to trust the people who put together her trip. After exploring Hong Kong, she was asked if she wanted to visit mainland China. After her positive experience in Hong Kong, she agreed. She went to mainland China and traveled around for another 9 days. The organizers then asked her if she wanted to visit Australia. Once again, she agreed. Before she left for her Australian trip, she was told that she had also won some designer purses. Trusting the organizers, she took the purses and packed them in luggage given to her by the organizers. It was at the airport, waiting to board her Australian flight, that she was called by airport security. They escorted her to her room, and her luggage was in the room as well. She was asked if the luggage belonged to her, for which she responded yes. She stated that she was asked multiple times, and each time she stated yes, not knowing drugs were in the lining of the purses. I hope you can see that something like this could happen to a lot of people. As a matter of fact, in May of this year, the Secret Service issued a warning for law enforcement to educate the public on similar schemes. Such a warning didn't exist in 2014. After her trial, she was found guilty and received the death penalty with a 2-year reprieve. She was duped, she was scammed, she trusted the wrong people, but she doesn't deserve this. My sister is trusting and believes that people are good. This ordeal has hurt her and has taken years from her life. While in prison, she has developed physical ailments, uterine fibroids, and possibly ovarian cancer, according to the doctors that examined her in prison. She has received numerous blood transfusions due to heavy bleeding and has been advised that she needs a hysterectomy, which she has refused out of distrust. How can she trust the same people who have incarcerated her after she cooperated with Chinese authorities? When I visited her recently in prison, I could see the depth of her depression. She has lost weight, her eyes are bulging, she has an abdominal bulge on her right side, and her complexion is very pale. She told me that she still has to work in prison despite her illness, but that she can't lift heavy objects because her fibroids might rupture and would start bleeding. After my visit to her, I updated my father on her condition. I had to leave out some details of her physical appearance because my dad is 91 and has recently been diagnosed with cancer. I wanted to avoid giving him additional shock. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my father. He's an Army vet, a retired Chicago police sergeant of 32 years. Policing is a family business. I followed in my dad's footsteps and served on the Chicago Police Department for 28 years until my recent retirement. Dawn Michelle is my dad's only daughter, and he is devastated by her predicament. In a strange way, my dad is locked up as well. He is worried with all this, he's not going to live long enough to see his daughter free and safe. He's getting worn down just like my sister. We've gotten our hopes up and down over the years, only to be disappointed again and again. This hearing today offers us some new hope that Dawn will not be forgotten. I've come to learn that Chinese law allows for transfer of prisoners out of China and doesn't require a bilateral prisoner extradition treaty. It is our hope that this mechanism can be used by the State Department to get Dawn Michelle out of prison, get her the medical care she so desperately needs, and get her back home. And I also like to add that my sister sent me a handwritten letter. And in this handwritten letter, she refused the surgery. And she said, and I'm going to quote, to bring some of her own words to this hearing, I, Dawn Michelle, refuse to take the surgery and will hold China liable for all the consequences from August 11, 2021 in regards to my tumor and safety of my life. I say this because China knows, in addition to the U.S. Embassy, that Dawn Hunt is innocent and has been since June of 2016. There is written documentation of the status in the courts and computers of Guangzhou No. 1 Detention Center. She also goes on to say, and I'm going to quote this, she says, the American government has sided with China and knows of my innocent status from Judge Zhang He-Tang on May of 2016, but did nothing for their own citizen and did not prevent me from coming to the Chinese prison, but left me out to dry, end quote. Gentlemen, this isn't political for me and my family. I'm just asking you, as a brother, just bring my sister home. Do whatever it takes. Just bring her home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt, and thank you. Mr. Humphrey.
Mike is, sorry about that. Good morning to you all. I have submitted detailed written testimony and will keep my oral remarks brief. I also have a bit of a speech impediment. Hopefully that won't occur this morning. I've spent almost 50 years involved with China in various roles, and 2 of those years were in Xi Jinping's prisons. Also, my American wife, Ying Sung Yu, both of us falsely accused of illegal information gathering for my due diligence company. And I've described this experience in great detail in the FT magazine in a long article a few years ago, and in the written testimony that I've submitted to you at this hearing. After my release, in between battles with cancer, PTSD, and a former client who got us into trouble, I decided to work to help other families suffering from similar ordeals. I have about 25 cases around the world in different countries, and I'm mentoring and supporting such families with a loved one locked up in China. I've accumulated many case studies and carried out a great amount of related research. The most important lesson from all of it is that not a single American prisoner held in China has had a fair and transparent trial, and prisoners there from any other country as well, for that matter. China's judicial system is a political system of oppression. It is not a system of justice. All of its organs, the police, the prosecution, the judiciary, the prisons, and the Chinese lawyers, form a single organic whole, all controlled by the Communist Party. No judge is independent or impartial. He is just a messenger of the party. The system is exploited by connected individuals to harm their perceived opponents and rivals. Cases are built upon forced confessions, often televised, and upon forced witness statements. Inside China's prisons, the prisoners, including Americans, are subjected to horrendous daily living conditions. In addition, there is forced labor for the prison's commercial profit. There is the withholding of proper medical treatment, even for cancer. And there is the writing of mandatory thought reports, in other words, brainwashing, to mention just a few things. And speaking of labor, these are Christmas cards that were packaged for a Western supermarket chain called Tesco by foreign prisoners in Shanghai's Qingpu prison, including American prisoners. The US government withholds the total number of Americans held in Xi Jinping's jails. Based on my inquiries and research over the years, I estimate up to around 300 Americans may be in some form of incarceration in China or under exit bans, mostly just because they are Americans. It is possible that not all of them are registered with American consulates. Now just remember, none of them have had a fair and transparent trial. Some are in dire health, some are over 50, aging rapidly, some of them have been in seized jails for over 10 years, and there for life. I don't think any of them deserve to be there. It doesn't matter what they're accused of. It doesn't even matter whether they are guilty or not when they have never had a fair and transparent trial in an independent court with an impartial judge. And in seized China, they never will. Today we see some new examples of American prisoners coming into the public view. Nelson Wells, Dawn Michelle Hunt, and David McMahon. They are horrific cases. They are the tip of an iceberg. And let me say something about David's case. David McMahon is the most egregious case, the most toxic case, the most disgusting example of China's injustice. He is one of my mentees. I shared a cell with him for 1 month in Shanghai in 2014 while he was trying to appeal. I interviewed him for a whole month. I call it an interview because throughout my life I have been a professional interviewer. I've conducted thousands of interviews as a journalist and then as a corporate investigator, and I know that David is innocent. This American primary school teacher was falsely accused and framed of molesting a 6-year-old child, a girl in the Shanghai French school. How toxic can you get? I hope you will all read the written testimony that I have submitted on David's behalf in his absence today, plus the testimony from investigator Cedric Wittek and ex-prisoner Marius Barlow. And I hope that you will read the protest letter that David McMahon wrote this year personally on his 43rd birthday in the 11th year of a 12-year sentence on a false conviction, an American robbed of his prime by the Xi Jinping system. Or I can read it for you if you want me to. I have it here. I can read a snatch, yeah? Let me get through this, Congressman, and then if you think I've got time, I'll read a snatch or two from it, okay? Today, only 3 Americans held in China have been on the list of the US Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs. One has just been released to our joy, probably because of this imminent hearing on the calendar, which China was very well aware of. The timing seems to be not a coincidence at all. But I believe that all Americans held in China qualify to be on that list. First of all, because there is no independent judicial system and none of them have had a fair and transparent trial. And that is the key criteria for qualifying them to be on that list based on the Levinson Act. It's good that we have this act, but I believe the US government should treat all American prisoners in China equally. I believe the US government must abandon its policy of non-intervention in these judicial cases in China and should intervene in them all. It has a duty of care to protect its citizens against abusive dictatorships and their so-called judicial systems. It can lead the world in this pushback like no other country can. I imagine that these families wonder which candidate in the upcoming election will bring their loved one home. In the final points and recommendations of my written testimony, I have called for legislation that would increase the onus on the US government to take real actions for its citizens imprisoned in China. As Alex Karp, the founder of software firm Palantir, said a few days ago, if you touch an American, we're going to make you and your friend's life hell. And that's the way it should be. Americans are suffering in Mr. Xi's dungeons. The United States must hold China to account. Just imagine a new kind of Magnitsky Act to target this problem. So thank you very much. Those are my remarks. If you think you would like me to read from David McMahon's letter, I'll do that. My name is David McMahon, and I've been imprisoned for the past 11 years for a crime that never happened. Maybe you've heard of me. I've sent letters to Ambassador Burns and to Roger Carstens, but neither has responded to me. I'm hoping you will. You is referring to the Consul General Scott Walker in Shanghai. I got released. I get released, as far as I know, in 1 year. Actually, it's next May. I think it's probably too late for anyone in the State Department to try to help me get released. I'm not asking for that anymore. What I'm asking now is this: why didn't you help me when you had the chance? I've read the entire Levinson Act. My case qualifies. I've read, copied from the SPIHA's website, what they consider to determine wrongful detention. But when my case was rejected, in other words, by SPIHA, they refused to tell me why. I believe, based on law, sorry, I'm struggling with his handwriting here. Let me move through it. I don't think you, anyone at the State Department, anyone at the FBI, any French law enforcement agency, or any of the Chinese investigators can justify what's been done to me. I'm not going to try my case in this letter, but I will simply state I am completely innocent. I'm going to jump. There are approximately 13 US citizens in this prison, and by the way, one of them is Kylie. They're in the same place. The State Department currently is only helping to recognize the release of one. He means Kai. 1 out of 13 from a country where all men are created equal, you only help one person? I remember when Brittany, I'm jumping, I remember when Brittany Griner's story was in the news. I don't believe for a moment that she was a drug trafficker, but let's be clear, she brought a small amount of illegal drugs into Russia. Her arrest was not in any way arbitrary. She was not arrested because of her race, sexuality, nationality, religion. She was arrested because she had drugs on her. And while the sentence handed to her was absurd, make no mistake, she was kind of guilty. Now I look at the Levinson Act and I look at the SPIHA's website and I ask myself, how the hell does her case qualify for help? I'm wrongfully imprisoned. I'm not telling you how to feel, but if I worked for the State Department, I'd be ashamed. Innocent Americans left to suffer while celebrities are home in time for Christmas. I used to think America was better than that. But I digress. If you know why my case was rejected for help, or if you can find out, I feel that I deserve to know. The SPIHA's secret process of deciding who to help and who to abandon totally lacks transparency. The decision not to help me not only hurt me very deeply, but my entire family. We deserve an explanation. David McMahon, Chengpu Prison.
Peter, thank you. We do have a short video from Catherine Swedan, the mother of Mark Swedan. She could not be here, but she asked that we play it right now.
My name is Catherine Swedan. I'm the mother of Mark Swedan. He's been wrongfully detained in China, Jiangmen, China, for 3,641 days, nearly 10 years. In a few days, it'll be 10-year anniversary. The way I would describe Mark is he's a good man. He's funny. He's very smart. He's also gracious, loves his mama. While I was on the phone with him at his hotel, I heard a lot of commotion. And he said, "Hold on, Mom." And Chinese police got into his apartment. They said, "We need to take you in for questioning." And the phone hung up. We figured, okay, he's going to be questioned. They'll find out the truth. There's nothing there. And they'll let him go. Didn't happen. I just can't fathom what Mark is going through. I know he's suffering. I received about 300 pieces of artwork, countless letters. He said, I'm in a lot of pain, physically and mentally. I'm in a dark place. He's made out on this picture to be his own superhero, that nobody's going to help him, so he has to do it himself. It took 8 years before anyone paid attention to me. I feel like I'm one little woman in all against China. When Mark comes home, I say when, not if, but when Mark comes home, I have to be greeting him coming off of that plane. And he said, Mama, I will come home in a box of ashes or walking off the plane, but I will come home.
Catherine, thank you for producing and submitting to this, to this commission that very moving video about your son. I know you're watching and know that, like our very, very distinguished people here who are advocating for their loved ones, we will work on that case as well as a commission and do everything we can. And Peter, thank you for the way you have taken the cruelty you suffered and your wife, and now have turned it into advocacy and with the precision of a journalist, asking all the right questions and doing everything you can to assist and to get us in government to do our part. Because we, again, there's some well-meaning people, but we don't do enough. And I think we have to triple our efforts. And this hearing, to me, is a pivot point for us to take that next series of steps. And again, Mr. Lee, your thoughts that this is a time for the Biden administration to really triple its efforts before it leaves, I agree with that. If that does not happen, know that we will try with whomever wins the White House to make this a very highest priority. These are Americans, these are your loved ones. And we can't sit by and say, well, there's only a few that are on the list. And I mean, that is absolutely, you know, I love the statement that you gave from David McMahon, who to help and who to abandon. I mean, that says it all. All have to be helped. All have to be helped. And, you know, I read the New York Times piece, Tim, about your, you know, Mira Wiesenthal, who parenthetically has testified before my committee in the past. She is an absolute truth teller, and she writes for the New York Times. And it was a very moving piece that she did. She did quote that your father, I believe it is, had said that he believes that she has been raped by the guards. And, you know, of all things, you know, a family of police officers who have protected innocent people your whole life, you know, your father, you, your relatives, to have that kind of indignity, that cruelty imposed upon her, that, again, motivates all of us, I think, to triple our efforts as well. And we will, I guarantee it. You know, I do know, and I know, Mr. Wells, you are concerned about this as well, that African Americans have been maltreated, perhaps even more so because of racism. I remember reading extensively about African students in China were mistreated so very often. So, you know, there they are studying in China and not being well treated. So there is a significant racist issue that you know, an undertow of hatred towards Africans and African Americans that has to be taken into consideration. But all people are equal and need to be protected. So, but we need to be aware of that, and that needs to come into the equation as well. I would ask you if you could, you know, the whole idea of not having a treaty or a way of transferring, you know, again, a trickle of people that are on there, on the list, that is unacceptable. You know, as you said, Peter Humphrey, you know, all these trials are sham trials. All these processes that are undergone, that if you're accused, you're guilty, that's it. And it's just how long you're going to serve. and on trumped-up charges to boot. So there is no judicial independence. The judges are all part of the Chinese Communist Party apparatus, and we need to realize that and not, put our head in the sands like ostriches, and kind of like say, well, we can't deal with that. Trumped-up charges, that's the worst game in the book. I could be trumped up if I go to China tomorrow. They could trump up. I'm barred right now from going because of my advocacy. But frankly, if I go, I am always aware that something can be put into my suitcase. Something can be, because they come in and they check your suitcases anyway. They rifle through them when you're in a hotel. It might be harder to do somebody that's an elected official, but not beyond. Your families are total risk. So, window of opportunity, we need to surge. But the surge has to go right into the next administration. This has to become the priority. These Americans have been left behind, the Chinese Xi Jinping has proven beyond any reasonable doubt that in the annals of history, he will go down as one of the worst dictators. But that doesn't mean everybody around him has to be complicit in that. There are people who hopefully will say, well, wait a minute, time out. The maltreatment needs to stop. It brings dishonor to the Chinese Communist Party to treat people in this horrendous way and not honor. Yeah, they're feared, big deal, but it brings dishonor and loss of face to so mistreat people and trump up charges. And I get your point about, with David Lynn, so what about your families? You were so happy for him to be released, joyous, but I understand the sense of disappointment that you feel anew. Hope rises, but and again, this idea of celebrities always getting, the additional focus, whatever they are, and I'm glad that reporters and basketball players, I'm very glad that they get out. But you're all celebrities, especially in the eyes of God. We're all equal in the eyes of God, and all people are equal and need to be treated so. So I would ask that all of us focus on that too. I mean, the media doesn't cover, the hardworking American man or woman, or like your sister Tim, who got tricked. How easy it is for them to trick your sister as they did. So I would just ask you if you'd want to respond to that, the idea that there should be no differentiation between a celebrity and somebody who's, a good, honest, hardworking person like yourselves. And again, not only the U.S., but the world has to stop its complicity by its indifference. And I know, and maybe you could speak to how the State Department has handled your cases, if you would. I know, because I just chaired a hearing on child parental abduction. I wrote a law on it 10 years ago. And they feel that they get short shrift from the U.S. Department of State. There are great people that start with the Department of State, but very often the individual cases get crowded out by big geopolitical concerns, and to me it should be the other way around, because the canary in the coal mine is how well or poorly they're treating that individual, that vulnerable person, and I think we need to make the biggest statement and push for your families. They're Americans. They need to be rescued. So if any of you would like to speak to how well or poorly you think the State Department, and not out of any fear of retaliation, we're all here to work for you. And that goes for the U.S. Department of State, it goes for the President, it goes for members of Congress, House, and Senate. So, you pay our salaries, you elect us. We have an obligation, a duty, to respond as aggressively and as effectively as we can. And again, Tim, reading that New York Times piece, just, again, the mistreatment, and Mr. Wells as well, because they're African-American, that's a further abomination in this process. So if any of you would like to speak to that. Mr. Hunt.
Yes, thank you, Senator. The State Department, American Citizen Services, they have been helpful in some ways. When my father went to visit my sister, he actually missed his flight. And when I went to pick him up, he wasn't on the flight, and I thought he was detained as well. And I did a quick phone call, and the person at ACS, she located him, told me, made me feel comfortable, and said, hey, he missed his flight. He's on this flight. He should be on his way home. However, as Mr. Wells stated, that these officers, they change quite frequently. So I'm not trying to downplay it, but it's almost as if when you call someone or when you write an email, it would be the same as if you have a problem, you call customer service and they say, oh yeah, well, I'm gonna transfer you to another department, and then you have to explain it all over again. And unfortunately, that being, I'm not trying to make light of it, but that's sort of what it is. And if it's that way with us, imagine how it is trying to get information from the prison about our loved ones if the counsels, the officers who are taking care of our loved ones, if they continue to change. They don't know our loved one's story. They don't know if they need medical attention, and they don't know if what they're going through because they're new. And try as they must, they have to get caught up to each individual case. And just to bring out quickly, it took me between 6 and 8 months to visit my sister because the Chinese prison didn't submit the paperwork to give to ACS so I can have permission to see her. However, ACS was helpful in facilitating my visit, but it took that long for me to have that visit arranged.
Mr. Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Smith, for asking the question. I will say, I echo Tim's statements, about ACS. They, for the most part, try their best to help. They have been able to push for, monthly consular visits for my dad. But yeah, of course, at the same time, it has varied. We've seen so many officers come and go very quickly. So, it's hard to maintain that long connection. I also wanted to speak to another aspect, which Peter touched on, reading from David's letter about designation of cases by the State Department. Now, of course, my father is fortunate to be one of the cases that has been designated, but obviously that's not the case for the others on the stage. And I fully agree that there's no transparency in that process. For the first 4 years, my dad also was not designated by SPIHA. We'd asked for it, and we just got a response, no, it's not going to happen. I've worked with a lot of other families who've tried to go through this process in other countries, and it's really the same. The Levinson Act is great, but there's no timeline for a response. There's no transparency, and it really does seem like families are owed that at a minimum, right? They should be provided the opportunity to be told, okay, if no, then why not? And what additional information is needed. But to my understanding, that's never been offered to any of the families. And so that, it's unfortunate that it's creating this kind of, division. It really should not be the case, and I think this process of designation needs to be reviewed thoroughly for that reason.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I would like to say that what Tim and Harrison said, I agree 100% on some of the things that they have said, and I share their same pain. But one of the things that appalled me the worst is when we called the embassy and they couldn't find my child. And it took an outside source to find him. And then after they did find him, we didn't know how to navigate through this at all, period. So we questioned how could you all support us in trying to get Nelson home. My response to what they said made me very angry, and I have spoken with an outburst many times on Zoom calls. I guess they probably feel they don't want to deal with Mr. Wells. And the reason is because I think the policies should be improved. I think they should have more power to be able to visit, to be able to get the medical records that we be demanding from the prisoners. When we asked them if there was any way they can advise us on legal reputations, they said, no, this is nothing we can do. So if you're a family of no political background or power, you're out there all alone. And I feel to believe that the embassy, being that they are supposed to support American citizens, should be more accountable for helping us in getting the support we need. Technically, if it hadn't been for Cynthia, as strong as she is, and staying up all night and corresponding with Mr. Humphrey and Mr. Cam, we would probably have never found Nelson. And to me, I think we need to do a better job.
Could I ask you,
Thank you.
Recently I put together a meeting with families, left behind parents through parental child abduction. Like I said, I wrote a law on that. And we had Rena Bitter, who's the Assistant Secretary for Consular Affairs, sit in on that meeting, as well as other administration people. And the beauty of it was she sat across from people who had very serious criticisms that need to be taken into account and then rectified. And she walked away after a 2-hour meeting, I believe, it was just recently we did this, saying we need to change this, we need to work on that. I would love if you can come back whenever you can. We can put together as quickly as you can. She's a very responsive person. She runs it all. There's always a problem with crossing into the political side with the assistant secretaries who often manage in human rights become a sub-issue, and that's been on every human rights issue, from religious freedom to you name it. But again, this is American human rights that are being violated with impunity. But I would invite you, if we could put together that meeting, we'll do it, and if you can come and share this with her and her staff, I think that will lead to serious reform, because she has been responding extremely well on the parental abduction issue. And she's done that before with some of the issues that we've brought to her attention. So I would invite you, we'll put it together, a week, 2 weeks, whatever works for you and her. Roundtable, no press, just talk and get it right. Because I think that feedback, they don't get it necessarily, does not percolate up to the top. Mr. Humphrey.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the comments the other three witnesses made about service on the ground, as it were, ACS, etc. I mean, everything they said, I can certainly confirm, because I've been involved in many cases, not just some of these here. Their experiences are very, very, very similar to my wife's as well, because my wife was in prison at the same time as an American citizen. And one of the questions that people often ask me about our experience is, how well did your government perform? How much did they help you? And I always answer this in a two-tiered way. I say, well, you know, there's the nanny and messenger service, first of all. And that's, you know, the service provided by consular officers who visit people in the prisons, and they're allowed to bring messages and letters and sometimes reading material and so forth, and to carry messages from you back to your family. And I call that the nanny and the messenger service. And I say, well, that service is provided very well by the UK consulate in my case, and by the US consulates in my wife's case. But there's this other level of service which I think is necessary, and that is at the higher political level, which is completely lacking. So it comes down to people when they visit us. You ask them for this or that, you ask them to do this or that, and they say, I'm sorry, we can't intervene in your case, right? That was the phrase I heard many times during consular visits, and my wife also heard this phrase many times. And that's wrong, you know, where there is no real justice. You know, you can't treat China as a country under the rule of law in the way we understand the rule of law to be for our own citizens. You have to intervene. And finally, in connection with the same issue, after my release and I started investigating my own case, what had happened to me and all the things I didn't know when I was behind those walls, I tracked down a former ACS officer, in other words, a State Department officer, who had been coincidentally both the visitor to my wife and the visitor to David McMahon at the same time in the Shanghai Detention Center. That's the pre-trial detention center. I tracked him down and I interviewed him twice for a couple of hours as part of my investigation. And he told me, how he would come away from visits to David McMahon feeling very, very troubled because, and then he said, there's a film I want you to watch. It's called The Hunt. The Hunt is a Danish film about a school teacher who is falsely accused of molesting a young boy. And the whole thing balloons into a witch hunt. And this poor man is almost harassed into suicide. And so he was basically telling me that he did not believe David was guilty. He visited him many times in his capacity, and he was coming away from this thinking, oh, this man is innocent. But I'm not allowed to say that. And when his superiors found out that I had been talking to him about this, he was silenced. Yeah. So I find this very unacceptable, and I think it's an illustration of this problem of we cannot intervene. We absolutely must intervene in these cases.
Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Wells, in your testimony, you note that the American Citizen Services in Beijing was very helpful in arranging visits or helpful in visiting, calling, communicating, reporting back. Were those visits, any of those visits by you or your family, or those were visits they were conducting and then reporting back to you?
Mr. Merkley, all those visits were from the ACS. We never had any visits at all, period. All information that we get is from them. And every communication that we may have, phone calls that we will engage, or some Zoom calls that we set up, and basically they will give us a personal comment as we speak. But it's always been emails and done by them.
Yeah. And I assume you've all sought to visit, but always been turned down.
Yes.
Yeah. And Mr. Lee, have you been able to visit then directly your father?
Senator Merkley, I have never visited my father in prison. I believe, he spent 3 years in a pretrial detention center where no outside visits were allowed. Now that he's in the prison, I believe he is allowed visits from family, but I've personally chosen not to visit my father as much as I would like to, due to the inherent risks of to myself and my family for doing so.
Yeah. It's something I'm going to follow up on in terms of trying to understand what the norms are and the protections are for Americans to be able to visit their family members. Mr. Hunt, you noted that your sister had a series of things, and I think that was your observations, like you were able to visit her?
Yes, Senator. In June of this year, I went to visit my sister. If you like to know, I can tell you, how it was. ACS did arrange that visit. However, there was a letter that ACS was supposed to tender to me And that letter was the letter that allowed me to visit my sister. It was basically the permission slip to visit her. And they didn't give it to me till the day of my visit. So there was nothing that I had before that except the communication from ACS, but not the communication that from the Chinese government that had their seal and their stamp that allowed me to visit. So I was still visited her without that letter. And I just want to bring up, just to highlight a point, that I didn't access my emails once I was in China. So the permission slip that ACS gave me I should have gotten that earlier, so I had it. I just went there with an ACS communication that is from our government, not a permission slip from their government. So that was one risk that I inherited. In visiting her, just so you know, there are armed guards, military-type guards that are outside of the prison that escort you with long guns, weapons, everything. They took my passport. They held my passport, which I understand why Mr. Lee would not want to visit, because there's no guarantee you're going to get your passport back. After this hearing, I don't believe it'll be advisable for me to go and visit my sister again.
And you mentioned ATS. ATS stands for?
ACS, American Citizen Services.
ACS, okay, just to clarify. And that is a group that's formally liaisoned with our State Department?
Yes, it's part of the State Department.
Part of the State Department, okay. I look forward to learning more about that, because I know visits can be pretty meaningful to those of our families that are detained, but the risks, the uncertainty about what else might happen. One injustice implies another injustice may occur. Several of you mentioned a Chinese law, and you expand on it in detail, Mr. Humphrey. 2018 PRC law on international judicial assistance in criminal matters. And you say that, if I understand the testimony right, saying that this law allows the opportunity for foreign prisoners to be transferred to a facility near their home, which I assume means back, in this case, in the United States. But then you note, to the best of my knowledge, the United States government has never explored this mechanism on behalf of any individual. Are there other governments that have been able to utilize this? Has Canada been able to utilize this? Has European countries been able to utilize this?
I know of two cases, successful cases by France, bringing citizens home that way. The other cases are not so prominent countries, not so obvious democracies, such as Turkey, for example, but France has been very diligent in helping its citizens get out of these situations in China.
So at least one Western nation has been able to utilize this. And I think that in your testimony you note that a response from our government as to why they have not explored this mechanism is that we do not have a transfer treaty with China, but then you note that a transfer treaty is not required.
Yes, I mean, between governments, it is possible to establish what's called a PTA, which is a prisoner transfer agreement. That is a treaty, and it provides a framework for prisoner transfers. I know a lot have been done with some of the Middle Eastern countries, but America doesn't have one. Some European countries do, and they have used the treaty mechanism to manage transfers. But the point about the law, Senator, the Chinese law, is that it provides a non-treaty pathway to do something similar on a case-by-case, individually negotiated basis, and the onus is on the foreign government to open the discussion by saying, we would like to speak to you about such and such a person. And this should be directed towards the Chinese Ministry of Justice and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there is no requirement on China's part that a PTA must exist bilaterally with that particular country in order to use this law. The American government, however, has taken the position that we can't do it without a treaty with China because somehow our law doesn't allow it. But I have actually not seen any law which disallows this.
Are you aware if our State Department has pursued the possibility of such a treaty?
The possibility of what, sir?
Such a treaty on.
I don't think so. I'm not aware that they have.
Well, certainly this is something that we can follow up on as well, both the treaty strategy and the 2018 use of the 2018 law, the fashion that France has used it.
Yeah.
Just as we've noted in your testimonies, China is not a rule of law nation. And so I'm well aware that no matter what they have in their law, when it comes to their strategy, and we see their strategy of transnational repression all the time of what they're doing to their own citizens as well as detaining our citizens. My heart really does go out to each of you on your family members detained under these various premises. I think about my own children. If my own child had been told they won a contest and were then developed a relationship over time going to Hong Kong and then to China and then invited to go to Australia and then told that they won some purses, they get to take those too. How easy, I mean, how easy and seductive that scam is, or to carry baked goods laced with drugs, or just to have something invented to detain somebody, to send a message to everyone else, in the case of your father, Mr. Lee. And our relationship with China, I think, has really took a terrible turn under President Xi. My impression is that these circumstances became much more difficult and common following Xi coming to power. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but Mr. Humphrey, can you comment on that?
I think that's accurate to say, as an overview on this whole thing of the last 10 or 12 years, that we've seen the situation growing steadily worse in China's prisons, and in particular for foreign prisoners who he is trying to drag down to the same treatment as Chinese prisoners, whereas 12 years ago, foreign prisoners were treated much better. But Senator, there was another point in connection with your original question to me, and that is that there's a very able American lawyer based in Beijing. His name is James Zimmerman, or known as Jim Zimmerman, and we have a memo from him on the subject of this Chinese law, where he sets out the case along the lines I just described to you, and we would be happy to share that memo with you.
Great, that would be...
And I can also assure you that John Cam holds a similar view as well on this topic.
And Mr. Wells, you mentioned in the beginning it was very hard to find anyone in the U.S. government to help. Is it, as you see others go through this, is the place that you direct them now, this American Citizen Services branch of the State Department, are they the key group to help facilitate contact with the Chinese government in regard to detained individuals?
Yes, I think that's something that they definitely need to improve on. And one of the things that was brought to my attention, Mr. John Cam, because he's a great advocate, there was always a list. Whenever an American was detained overseas, that would come on his radar. And the shocking thing was, when we spoke to him, he said that, I'm surprised that Nelson didn't come on our radar. So when we contacted the embassy, he was able to find him before the embassy was. And I'm like, confused because it took his information for him to give it to us and for us to give it to them. And that was when they were able to find him.
No, that does raise real questions about what network existed that our government didn't succeed in accessing when you were in need. You've given us, you've shared your stories, which, as I mentioned in my initial statement, by you speaking to us, you're really speaking to our nation. And this process publicizes not just your individual cases, but the overall challenge that we face with citizens being detained in China. And so, and you've given us some ideas of how we might pursue improvements. So thank you very much for taking the time and effort to be here. I hope that there is a celebration in each of your futures. You're not only helping your own family members, you're helping many other families as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Just to conclude, have any of you had any contact with our ambassador, Nicholas Burns? Has he been in contact with you? No? Yes?
Yeah, I will comment that in our case, Ambassador Burns has been in touch with their family. He has fortunately visited my father 3 times in prison. We're grateful for the work that he's doing, and for my father, and I know he's also visited Mark Swadan, but ultimately, he's not going to be able to bring them home, and we need a more coordinated, larger government effort.
Mr. Wells?
For our family, we've had no contact at all, and to my knowledge, I'm not even sure he's even aware of my son.
Well, he will be after today, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Mr. Hunt?
No, my family has had no contact with him.
Again, if you're not on the right list, you don't have contact, and
Right.
that's
That's correct.
contemptible. I mean, as, again, Peter Murphy pointed out, it's not a rule of law country. So we will do our level best to engage him. Interestingly enough, Daniel Crittenbrink, who is the Assistant Secretary for Near East and Pacific Affairs, he's on this commission. So it would be very helpful with a meeting with you, as the beloved family members, to have that kind of meeting with a member of the commission who is also a point person for the administration with regards to policy. And I would also add that Azra Zaya is also, she's the undersecretary. She's been at some of our hearings, and I know her staff is following this today. If we put together a meeting to just convey all of this, and your points, I have to say this, I understand how frustrating it is when they change case officers and somebody is reading a chart somewhere, maybe, about your case. One time, I was so frustrated with this transference of the case to some other else who has no idea what your case is all about. And that's if they even open up a case for you. It reminded me of I'm a big Seinfeld fan, and there was one famous episode where George Costanza had the Penske file, and he kept holding the file, saying, "I've got the," and nothing was happening with it. It was just information that was going nowhere, nothing actionable. So, by being here today, my hope is it'll help make your cases actionable. Mr. Lee, I know that yours already is, but Mr. Wells and Mr. Hunt, yours is not, at least the way it should be. So we'll work on that, and we'll try to get Daniel and others to come and meet, as well as the head of Consular Affairs. I have found that Consular Affairs are very often very empathetic, but it stops there, as you pointed out, Peter, when it gets to the political side. And this is something that causes consternation at the political level, so therefore we drop it and don't do all that we can do. So I think your point was so well taken. Michelle Steele, by the way, is still with us. Michelle, did you have a question or any comment you wanted to make?
Yeah,
Oh, good.
I just have a questions because I've been engaging with State Department because I have another constituent has been detained in China. So we try to work with them, and we try to ask the State Department that how they negotiated to release Pastor Lin this time. So to all the witnesses, how can we improve policy tools and resources to deter foreign governments from engaging in the wrongful detention of US nationals and citizens of other countries such as China, Vietnam, North Korea, and others? Are there policy options could Congress consider to disincentivize foreign governments for engaging in the wrongful detention of US nationals? Anybody can answer this if you have any idea.
It sounds to me really like a question for senators and congressmen to address. I don't think any of us really are qualified to make such suggestions at a really high level.
So you don't have.
What deterrents could we introduce to deter that awful government in Beijing from arresting so many Americans? It's hardball, you know. You have to play hardball back. What else can I say? I mean, obviously, I'm not suggesting that you go around arresting lots of Chinese citizens who are innocent in America, but you are the leader.
Thank you, Mr. Humphrey. The thing is that, what we've been working with State Departments a lot of times that we get very frustrated and, open up the conversation. That's the more of the State Department's issue, that it was the one I asked. But you know what? Let's go that the next, what's going to be so helpful for you, all of you, that what role do other leaders and those global platforms have in raising awareness on this issue, especially corporate America or people with major platforms? Should they call out the abuses and raise awareness? Because I'm saying this because I actually sent a letter out before the Beijing Olympic. We had 17 corporate sponsors for the Olympic. They spent billions of dollars, and I asked them, can you use a little bit of that platform to find out, to let whole world know that what China is doing, how China is abusing the system, and they're the one detaining our, it's not just our, US citizens, but at the same time, the human rights violations that they've been practicing. It's just awful that, we hear those stories. So do you think is it good that these corporations, but by the way, after we send a letter out to those 17 Olympic sponsor corporations, none of them answered to our office. So do you think that they should use major platforms, and then, we have to let the whole world know what China is doing?
I think that this problem of the types of prisoners who we've been discussing today, and we're not talking about Chinese political prisoners or religious prisoners in general, but the type of prisoners we're talking about today are people who are accused of common crimes. I would call them common crimes, whether it's theft or fraud or rape or whatever, whether they're guilty or not. And this is a systemic problem that so many people are getting prosecuted and convicted on totally murky bases, with no fairness, no transparency, no proper defense. So this is systemic, it's the Chinese system. And one thing you can do is talk more to other governments of similar mind and spirit about this, to try to exert more international influence, put more pressure on China to behave. I don't see that happening very much when it comes to the prisoners who are accused of common crimes. I think they're often very, very forgotten about. But you can do that, I think. You only need to get 4 or 5 or 6 governments together on the same page, on the same platform. I would point out that later this month, the Australian Senate is holding a hearing similar to this one. They have an inquiry ongoing, and they will report in November. I will be speaking at this Senate hearing there. And I think that's another example of how you can connect. In the UK, we've had a lower key thing last year, which I participated in, and I'm working at the moment to try and get something like this convened in the EU Parliament as well. So I would suggest that's one way of strengthening your muscle internationally, is to combine with other countries to provide a united front against China to behave.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Nunn?
Well, thank you, Chairman, very much for bringing us all together here to talk about just a historically challenged within Beijing. As we look at bringing Americans home, I think you have highlighted specifically the intent by the Communist Party within China to use Americans as a pawn in a larger political game. So let me be clear from the get-go, Mr. Chairman, that any nation that holds Americans hostage to exert their political will against the United States is first and foremost responsible for those Americans' safety and their safe return to the United States. And second, that the full weight of the American people is looking on those countries to be responsible actors in making sure those hostages are brought home. We expect our citizens to be treated well, and we expect them to be released. As an Air Force officer for more than 2 decades serving on our nation's front line, I know that no mission is complete until every American makes their way back to U.S. soil. It is completely unacceptable, even though China is our #1 trading partner, that there are more Americans detained in China than anywhere else on Earth. Due to the lies and deceptions by the Chinese Communist Party, we are unsure exactly of how many Americans are even being held today on the mainland in China. But what we do know is that our fellow Americans, including this incredible panel before us today, is on the front line of exposing how many Americans are being held in captivity, including Kai Li, Nelson Wells Jr., and Don Michelle Hunt. Each face unknown health concerns, potential threats of torture, mistreatment at the hands of the CCP. I want to begin by thanking each of you for taking time to come here today to share your stories and be the face for so many stories that remain unspoken at this time. The threats from the CCP range. We know that it's false imprisonment for trumped-up charges of espionage simply for preaching Christianity in China, to family members who were detained and used as political pawns against the United States. These Americans have unjustly and unfairly found their freedom stolen by the Chinese Communist Party. It's our duty today to bring attention to these very important cases and work hard to ensure that we bring all of our brothers and sisters back home. So thank you each, and Mr. Humphrey, I'd like to begin with you. You are a China expert. You're a former CCP detainee yourself. In fact, in June of this year, 4 citizens from my state, teachers from Iowa, teaching at Cornell, were viciously attacked in rural China, simply for being Westerners. But certainly it appears that the attack may have been propagated by an anti-West feeling stoked by local officials. According to ABC News, these 4 instructors from Cornell were brutally attacked simply by bumping into a 55-year-old Chinese national. There seemed to be an overall hostility towards Westerners throughout the region. So I want to begin. Does the CCP look for opportunities to target, attack, and arrest ordinary citizens while operating in China?
Yeah, what we can say, I think, is that the CCP under Xi Jinping's leadership, in other words, him, has fostered an atmosphere of xenophobia in China during his reign. And we've seen it expressed initially in policies towards the outside world, and we've seen it expressed in constraints and harassment of foreigners in China. But there's an element in the Chinese population which takes these kind of signals as signals to get rough with people and I mean, there was a prisoner, American prisoner, held in the same cell as Nelson Wells some years ago. He's out now. He's a footballer, and his name's Wendell Brown, up in Detroit. And he was certainly a victim of that type of arrest, where he was working, coaching in China, and he started to get bullied in a bar because he was with a Chinese lady, and some local people started a fight with him, and he got arrested and jailed for brawling. I think he was held for a few years, 2.5 years, something like that. And a skillful Chinese lawyer got him out in the end with a reduced sentence. That's an example of this atmosphere that you're talking about, Commissioner Nunn. Xi Jinping has engendered an atmosphere of hatred of the outside world in China today. Not everyone buys it, but the kind of people who beat up, your 4 guys from Iowa, they were victims of precisely this atmosphere which he has created. He came to power saying, we need to clean up all this foreign trash we've got in China. And that was precisely the time when we saw this wave of people getting arrested and imprisoned in the category of Dawn Hunt, Nelson Wells, and Mark Swedan. They all were taken in that period as that atmosphere was being whipped up by the new Xi Jinping regime. I hope that answers your question.
No, Mr. Humphrey, thank you very much. And let me first say, as somebody who has worked as a counterintelligence officer in Guangzhou, the large swath of Chinese people truly believe in a greater humanity. And it's a salute to those who are trying to push back against this type of brutality coming out of it.
Yeah.
But this is clearly a dictate coming from the CCP, trying to identify leverage, in my opinion, against the United States. And their tactic now has become this incarceration of U.S. citizens to use as leverage. And
I agree.
From Hamas or anyone else.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely.
Let me ask this. When the CCP arrests and detains American citizens, what do you believe is the ultimate goal when they take these individuals in, as you know, for brawling years in a Chinese detention facility?
I mean, I think, in a way, they see it like as a warehouse, right? And they're building up inventory in that warehouse to trade off when they need to. In fact, one of my detention center guards, a senior one, once said to me, "We're just a warehouse. We move people in, and at some point in time, we move people out." So that metaphor is very applicable, I think. They're building stock to trade on.
That is frightening. And I think absolutely something we would say in the military, building a stock of blood chits that they get to cash in that happen to be U.S. citizens that they're housing. In your words, and I think is correct, warehousing American citizens for a time that they want to gain leverage over the United States.
Yeah.
Can I just briefly, what are their tactics that they're using? You noted instigating a brawl to be able to identify them. Are these intended targets? Are they looking across the board? Is it happenstance? How do they go after what you call these common crimes to be able to draw a noose around an American?
I do think it's partly happenstance and opportunism when an opportunity arises, and it involves those kind of people, those kind of Chinese people, those elements. They take the opportunity. I mean, I know many cases where foreigners, including Americans, have been subjected to this treatment over the last 10, 12, 15 years. It's been quite common.
And Mr. Homer, you brought up a very good point here. This is not unique to just the United States.
I couldn't hear.
I said this is not unique just to the United States.
Well,
they are targeting other nations as well. Could you share with us who else is being targeted in these wholesale roundup of foreigners?
I think the Japanese are a particularly favorite target because even though there's not such a large number of Japanese in prison in China, they're harassed a lot because there's a lot of hatred towards the Japanese nation in China. But we see it also with Australia. Australia has a substantial number of prisoners in China. And in general, towards the Laowai, the Darbis, or the foreigners around in China. There are less of them now because in recent years they've been leaving in an exodus. There are far fewer foreigners in China now because of this atmosphere which has been created.
I'd like to talk to the families, particularly those who have loved ones currently in detention there. It's an open question, but Mr. Lee, I'll start with you. Your father was arrested on unspecified so-called espion charges. How are Americans treated when they go through these Chinese courts? You had a front row seat to it. Is it transparent? Is there an appeal process? Does the accused get any kind of defense?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Nunn. Yeah, look, it's certainly not a transparent process. I think that goes without saying. Like I said, my father did not have access to legal representation in the first 6 months when he was being interrogated. The trial was behind closed doors. Members from the consulate tried to attend, but were not able to get in. And, it's because allegedly the trial is about quote unquote state secrets, so that's a convenient way for them to bar access to the trial. It's certainly not a transparent process. It's a long process. For my father, it was 2 years from initial detention to sentencing. For a lot of others, it's been unfortunately much longer. In terms of an appeal process, such a process exists. My father did appeal his sentence. Ultimately, it got denied, as I'm not aware of a single case in which an appeal has been successful.
Mr. Wells, first of all, thank you for your military service and long-rendered sacrifice for our country. You are now fighting another battle to bring your son home. When he was detained by the Chinese, can you speak to or are you aware of the type of environment he was placed in once in the Chinese detention facility, how he was treated, and what updates you have on his well-being?
Thank you, Mr. Nunn. As I stated before, it took us a while to find Nelson, so he was in the detention center quite a long time. And while he was there, he wasn't able to reach out to us. So when we did find out where he was at, and we contacted numerous lawyers, and that didn't work out well, but there was one lawyer that he picked up the case and he said, I will try to assist Nelson. But by the time he got there, Nelson had already been going to trial. And as Mr. Harrison said, it was closed. He didn't have anybody to speak for him, so it had to be through interpretation. But it was already stamped that Nelson was going to be guilty regardless. But one of the things that the lawyer did tell us, he said, while I was there, I was able to do two things. The first thing is that I listened to what the case was about, and he said that it was inconclusive. He said, as far as I'm concerned, Nelson should be free. The second thing that he was able to do is to tell Nelson that your parents are aware that you are in this situation and that they are doing everything they can so that you will not feel like you are all alone and by yourself. That was the only two things that he was able to do. But when Nelson finally talked to us, and you got to remember that all his phone calls are monitored, they're censored. So when he had the opportunity to talk to us, he started telling us the duress that he was under, how he was being treated, how the guards were handling him, and doing things that, to me, is inhumane. So he was crying out, Pops, get me out of here. Get me out of here. I can't take it. So I told him, as we started discussing, they hung up the phone. Later, he was able to give us another call 6 months later. He asked us, was we doing any progress? And he was still in this detention. So he said, I got to get out of here. So I set up an appeal, and the appeal should help me get out. Is there any legal assistance that you could help me with? And I told him that it's hard to tell your child that your hands are tied. So I told him I was not capable, but I will do everything that I could. So that's when he decided, I have to, under coerce, and being through what he was going through, he decided to do a plea. And at that point, that's when they accepted his appeal. And then they accepted to put him in a regular prison system to get him out of detention. And then he was able to give us code on telling us how he was being treated. He would reminisce a movie or anything of that nature and say, Pops, remember this movie? It went like this. And that's how we understood what he was going through. Nelson has been attacked because in the situation that he's in, he's the only American and only Black American in the prison where he's at. So he has no communication with anyone to speak English. So everything he does, it has to be within himself, eternal. All the guards are Chinese, all the inmates are Chinese. And so he has been attacked just for who he is, being American, a Black American. He has been put in the hospital several times, as well as the fact he's been attacked by guards, which was just recently. So the situation that he's going through, when he communicates this to us, we tell the ACS, and we ask them to do more frequent visits, because from Beijing to where Nelson is, I understand it's quite a distance. So they will only go see him at 3 months, every 3 months. Well, we were requesting that they would go see him at least once a month because of the fact he's out there on his own. And the correspondence that we get to him when we send it through, like Mr. Humphrey said, it's a nanny service. When we give him, our family members writes letters to him and books that we try to send to him, and it is being screened by the guards, and they won't allow him to have it. So that means it'll be at the prison, but he can't receive it because of the fact they feel it's not appropriate. So it takes away from his communication with his family and loved ones. So to answer your question, while he was in the detention center, he tried to explain that he was sleeping on the floor, and as Mr. Lee said, because of the weather, he said, send me some clothes so I can weather the winter, because the windows are open. There's no way to close the windows. So his plea to us has always put an emotional strain on us as well, because we know our child is suffering. And that detention center, for those that go there and they stay there for a long periods of time, that's a stressful situation.
Mr. Wells, you are doing so much for your son, even just by being here today to raise the awareness to the American people. As a father, I compliment you. As a warrior, we thank you. And for your son, Nelson, not only do our hearts go out, there must be action taken on our side to hold the Chinese accountable, and you have our commitment for that. I'm grateful for you being here. Mr. Hunt, thank you for your service first and foremost as a Chicago police officer. You are one of these great heroes from the heartland. You have been on the front line here in the United States protecting our country, and certainly there is a need for public safety, but it is different when a foreign country seeks out Americans to use as political tools going forward. Your sister Dawn, a woman detained inside China. Speak to us about what the Chinese have put her through while in the detention facility and what information you've been able to get out, because we hear reports here of health concerns, of potential threats of torture, of mistreatment at the hands of guards, particularly of females. I can't imagine how difficult this is for you.
Thank you, Mr. Nunn. Yes, my sister conveyed to my father that she was sexually assaulted in the detention facility. I understand what Mr. Wells was saying because his story It's the same story that I have. Denial of access to reading materials, only being able to have anything in Chinese, and she doesn't understand it. The cold, laying on the floor, requesting blankets, the food, everything, Mr. Wells, every story that you've heard is correct. Our citizens are being mistreated, abused, and it's coordinated. It's not something that is a one-off. It's not, oh, it happens to this prisoner, it doesn't happen to others. It happens to every prisoner. I understand that we are convened here today so we can give you information. I hope you take this information to heart. And I say this because during the visit with my sister, there was a person who was standing right next to her with the headphone on, listening to everything we said, taking notes. I asked my sister about the sexual assault. She briefly looked up, looked down, and there was a tension there I could see in her eyes, I could feel, and she said no. But I knew she was under duress. I knew that her freedom to tell me the truth had been taken away. Now imagine, not only is your freedom of movement taken, but your freedom to tell the truth, your freedom to speak up, your freedom to cry out, your freedom to ask for help is taken as well. That's what I need this panel to understand. That's what all of our family members are going through, right here, right now.
Mr. Hunt, that is powerful. It is real. Mr. Chairman, I am so grateful for you doing this fact-finding hearing that is both bicameral, that is bipartisan, that has the White House's ear, and it is clear that not only does more need to be done, but we have to recognize the strategic threat here as well as the tactical human suffering that's going on. We've heard, Mr. Humphrey, that this is a coordinated effort by the Chinese Communist Party to build a warehouse of U.S. citizens in detention facilities that these families and so many, many more are going through right now. That there is a intentional coercion of American citizens while in Chinese detention facilities to either plead guilty so that they can speak to their family and have at least some hope of an appeal, or remain in a solitary environment year after year. And challengingly, as you've each highlighted, in any country in the world, we would consider this to be barbaric. But in a country that presents itself as an equal to the United States, to strip another citizen of not only their freedom, but their humanity, this must be called into question, held accountable, and we need to recognize that China not only is playing the long game here, but continues to build an arsenal of Americans to be held in detention at a time and place of their choosing to be able to negotiate against the United States. We should never allow this to happen. I thank the panel for being here. Our hearts are with each of your family. We will maintain the fight. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nunn. And I would ask you, I'll give you final, last word to each of our witnesses. But before that, as you probably know, there are 4 levels of travel advisory. The first is exercise normal precautions. Number 2 is exercise increased caution. Number 3, State Department calls it reconsider travel. And number 4 is don't travel. Right now, the PRC is reconsider travel because of the arbitrary enforcement of laws and people being incarcerated simply because they happen to be Americans. In your view, should the State Department now go to don't travel, since we have a situation where your family members traveled and have now been unjustly detained and harassed and imprisoned? It seems to me that would get the attention of the Chinese Communist Party as well, because it's an open risk. People are traveling there not even knowing that there is a travel advisory. That's number 3 on the 4 scale. But perhaps it's time for number 4 to be imposed. Peter, did you want to respond to that?
I'll be very quick.
Yes.
It's one phrase I've been using for quite some years now, and it's starting to dawn, and that is nobody is safe in China. Nobody.
Don't travel to China. That needs the security level. Whatever you do, it needs to be raised to the highest it could be raised to. Don't travel.
So that's your word to the administration.
That is my word right here, right now. Don't travel. None of us here want to have another story.
Thank you.
I will say this, it's been reported in the media that the Chinese government has requested the United States to reduce its travel advisory from level 3 down to level 2 or level 1. And, I think it is laughable for that they are even willing to consider that, while they keep our loved ones arbitrarily detained. And so, I think that, the Chinese government clearly wants more Americans to travel to China, but as long as our loved ones are being held, as long as there are so many people at risk, then that travel warning must be escalated.
Thank you. Mr. Wells.
If this would put pressure on the Chinese regime, I say, don't travel.
Thank you.
No one should even go there.
I appreciate that. I give you now the last word. I do, by unanimous consent, ask that statements from Bill Browder be included. Ben Rogers, who we've worked with, for both of those men for years. Cedric Whittick, Cynthia Sun, Jason Poblet, Kathleen Sweden, right, who was on earlier with her son, and the Foley Foundation. Without objection, so ordered. But I'd like to give the 4 of you the last word, if you would. And I can't thank you enough. This, to me, is a pivotal hearing. Motivation is everything, but information that motivates. You have motivated us to do even more, and we will, I guarantee it. Mr. Wells.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am grateful that we and all of these people who are in the same situation as us are here today in front of you all to wake awareness to our situation as well as the other Americans that's there. My last comment is that there was always 3, and Mr. Lee knows that these were on the radar of our administration. And we tried to get Nelson's name included. And today, you all have done that for us. And I know Tim agrees. But there's one thing that you all noticed, the picture that you all put out there. If you notice that everybody else is in civilian clothes, my son is in his prison uniform. And I was apprehensive and afraid, but I knew I needed to do this because everything that we do is going to help get him home. But that uniform prison picture that's out there, Nelson has received death threats. He has received harassment and even attackments because of that picture. And they tried to force him to say how that picture got to us. And because we could not tell how it was done, Nelson has suffered under their hands. So I am proud and happy to be here. This picture has now shown the American people about my son, but I'm also afraid of what might happen to him from this. So I know you all are going to be diligently trying to help us, but there's one other thing that I wish, that you all can at least get the American citizens, counselors to make more frequent visits to get Nelson to make sure they don't harm my child. Because if the illness don't take him out, I'm afraid they will. Thank you.
I would just like to end with this statement, building off what Mr. Nunn just mentioned of China wanting to present itself as a country that is equal to the United States, yet at the same time engaging in these horrific practices, ripping apart our families, ripping apart our loved ones, torturing them physically, mentally. It needs to stop. And whatever other bilateral issues that need to be worked out, irrespective of that, these cases have a tangible solution. The Chinese government has our loved ones. They can do the right thing and release them. And it's incumbent on our elected leaders to call for that, to make that the number one priority in their diplomacy, because it is something tangible, something doable, something with a clear-cut solution. So it should be one of the easiest things to get in diplomatic discussion. So I think by bringing awareness to this issue that is easy to get swept under the rug, because we are individual families, ordinary Americans, who have a difficult time getting attention. That's we need to be heard. We need to be made a priority. And so I thank you, of course, Chairman Smith, Senator Merkley, but also all the commissioners on the CECC for convening and organizing this hearing and this forum to listen to our voices and take to heart and understand just what we have been going through and why it needs to be rectified immediately. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Humphreys, and everyone who's here on this panel. Thank you for allowing us to speak. I will state this just to repeat what you said, how to keep up the pressure. You asked, should we raise the threat level? Of course. The other senator asked, is there something we could do, socially by holding these companies responsible? And yes, of course. I say this because my sister was making lithium batteries. That was her job, her duty while she's incarcerated. I'm not sure what products these lithium batteries go to, but I'm sure that some of these are imported here in America. I'm sure the citizens here need to understand, and they need to know that the Chinese motto is rehabilitation through labor, and a lot of this labor, as Mr. Humphrey says, they go in making greeting cards that we purchase. There needs to be sort of transparency on what products are being made by prison labor. If those things are transparent, then that puts pressure on them, as well as what you said, raising the threat level. Because from what Mr. Humphrey said, if it's going to be a warehouse of Americans that they're going to use to gain political favors or use to do something to, I guess you could say, move the needle on their side by releasing a citizen from America, that needs to stop. And we need to put all type of pressure on them through it, political, economic, judicial, whatever we can do to bring everyone home, we need to do it. No one needs to be in this situation, and this panel should not grow. There should be fewer of us, not more of us. Thank you.
Yeah. I prefer to leave most of these final words to these three very courageous families that you've got here today. But I'll just say one thing very, very briefly, and that is that I think it impinges upon the Congress to legislate to deal with this problem of the prisoners in the categories that we've discussed today. You mentioned you received a statement from Bill Browder, who we could say was the creator of the Magnitsky Act concept, a great campaigner who brought that about here. It was aimed heavily at the time against other countries, especially Russia, for human rights abuses and wrongful arrests and mistreatments of prisoners and so forth. And we need something like that here to confront this problem with China. So I think it impinges upon Congress here to push some legislation forward which will be punitive in nature and also will be holding the US government to greater account to actually act and punish China for these kinds of wrongful detentions and arrests. I hope to see that in the next year or two. I realize that you're going to go through some changes over the coming year, which may slow some progress down, but this is a bipartisan issue, and I don't really think it matters who's running the administration. I think it impinges upon every congressman and every senator to get behind something like this. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a duty to act, and we must, so thank you. Who do we help and who do we abandon? To paraphrase again, we help all and abandon no one. And I can't thank you enough for the powerful testimonies and for the love that you have shown for your loved ones. It's incredible. Hearing's adjourned.